So for those of you that haven't met me, I'm Kathryn Dyer, and I'm the Nevada State Range Lead for BLM, as well as the National Outcome-Based Grazing Project Lead. And so I get to work with all of the outcome-based projects throughout the West, which has been an incredible experience. What we will be doing in this symposia is I will present basically an overview of outcome-based grazing, some of the unique characteristics that separate it from, the classic grazing permits and approach, and then we will have two separate projects speak more in depth about their outcome-based projects. And so we'll have my presentation, then we'll have a couple questions, and then we will have Autumn from Oregon, and then a couple questions on that, and then we'll have Cheryl and Niels from Wyoming and a couple questions on that, and then we will have all of us up here and open questions for the remainder of the time. So, in this overview, what I'd like to do is just give you a tiny bit of information about the range program in BLM nationally, and then some unique characteristics of the outcome-based grazing initiative, and talk a little bit about the legal strength. It's impossible not to address this because it is something that we need to be ready to have a strong response to. And then I'll briefly touch on the 11 national projects that we have, why flexibility is important, why collaboration is important, and monitoring as being the linchpin of all this, and some ideas as we look forward to how this continues to progress and expand. So I just want, for anyone that's not familiar with this, the range program of BLM nationally is enormous. So we have over 21,000 allotments nationally. We have over 18,000 grazing permits nationally, over 245 million acres of land involved in grazing allotments nationally. So this is a big deal, and you can imagine that through all of these different permits and states and allotments, the amount of variety that's seen in size and topography and ecological sites and conditions in every aspect of the ground and the livestock operations. So a little bit about the original concept is, the purpose of outcome-based grazing in its simplest form is to meet vegetation and habitat objectives through partnerships. And I think the driving force of some of this was, recognizing that we were working at people, not with people, and that's not the way that you achieve great results. So we wanted to be able to provide demonstration projects in a variety of different geographic areas and ecological conditions. And then we want to transfer that information and experience to make some national policy to be able to expand the opportunity for flexibility to all the permit holders on BLM lands. And so we're looking broader scale in this and again, recognizing the variety that exists throughout grazing lands nationally. There's some 100-acre allotments, there's some million-acre allotments, and there's everything in between. And so some areas are already looking on a larger scale by default of allotment size, and then sometimes land health evaluations are being done on a very small scale. And so we want to start looking at the larger scale whenever possible, and we want to look towards objectives as opposed to prescriptions. And one other thing that makes this unique is that we also recognize there's a variety of objectives which are not all ecological. There's ranch objectives, there's economic objectives. A ranch has to be economically viable in order to be able to maintain itself on that landscape. And then there's also social and cultural objectives, and all of these things interplay. And mostly we want to develop the voluntary cooperative partnerships. So the original concept also included this monitoring and evaluation plan. How are you going to know if you're meeting your objectives if you're not effectively monitoring? And so having short and long-term objectives, an evaluation schedule, and identify actions that you can take if you're not meeting the objective that you defined, and then also wherever possible. We have intermixed public-private, we have state lands, we have Forest Service adjacent sometimes, so whenever possible to make a management plan that includes the variety of lands that would be involved in that. Okay, monitor achievement of goals in each of the demonstration projects, and then analyze that achievement in light of the management decisions and develop long-term policy. And the long-term policy is sort of being developed concurrently with all of the evolution of this project. And so this is sort of, as you guys know, this is in many ways adaptive management further refined. So an OBGA, outcome-based grazing authorization permit, must contain achievable and measurable resource objectives, SMART objectives, a description of monitoring that's going to track and confirm achievement of those objectives. These need to be defined up front. Flexible terms and conditions. So you may have a plant phenology as a turnout condition as opposed to a March 1st date or something of that nature. Clearly described adaptive management actions to address the change in any and all conditions. We'll get to that a little further. And a list of possible actions that you could take to maintain your trajectory towards meeting your objectives. So this is a paper that was done in 2014. It's a legal paper, actually, and what they looked at was hundreds of court cases where the agencies lost in adaptive management cases. And so they found that the recurring themes were that we were most deficient in lack of objectives and processes, monitoring thresholds, and defined actions triggered by thresholds. There remains a mismatch in U.S. administrative law between the flexibility demanded by adaptive management and the legal objectives of transparency, public participation, and finality. So, again, we had a recurring theme of failure to establish objectives, failure to define monitoring decision thresholds for monitoring. So it's not enough to monitor, you need to know what that monitoring means. And a failure to identify response actions, basically, for when your monitoring shows that something's not happening the way you wanted it to. So I kind of liked this one because it's another, so we're not allowed to just say, trust us, we'll fix it later. We need to have a clear idea of what we want to do and how we're going to do it now. So there's two policies, or a policy and an IB, which isn't really policy, I guess, but that's another conversation. So the flexibility in livestock grazing management is the Bureau's policy on how to incorporate flexibility into a livestock grazing NEPA analysis and the subsequent permit that comes from that. And the main things that it requires are, no surprise, objectives, monitoring plan, thresholds, and responses. And the other accompanying IB is the cooperative monitoring memorandum of understanding. So at a national level, PLC and BLM have developed the understanding that we all need to contribute to the monitoring. And so these cooperative monitoring plans, per the flexibility IM, they're required to include the objectives and desired outcomes that are to be monitored, the monitoring methods and protocols, the schedule for collecting data, the responsible party for collecting data, an evaluation schedule, and a description of the anticipated use of the data. And so this is pretty straightforward. What are we going to look at? When are we going to look at it? Where are we going to look at it? And what monitoring methods are we going to use? And what in the world will we do with the data that we get from it? And so cooperative monitoring, as you can see, is an overarching theme of this. Cooperation in general is an overarching theme of this. And we have, you saw how many grazing permits and allotments we have. We have 326 range specialists nationwide, and I'm sure not all those positions are full right now. And so you can see this is a larger job than we could do without the permittees' contributions to it. And so We also, in the cooperative monitoring plan, will need to have identified what are the variety of things that a permittee could respond to immediately without any conversation with BLM, what are the variety of things that they may need to respond to immediately, but that we need to have some process for collaboration after they respond, and then what are the things, construction of projects. There are some things that we're not going to be able to authorize without the conversation and authorization beforehand. And the weight on the permittee's shoulder through this is also that they need to contribute to that monitoring, not just with on-the-ground data collection, but with good records of pasture moves and all of their component parts for what they're doing livestock management wise. We need very good records of those, and we also need good records of what flexibilities on any year they did implement and what drove that action and what resulted from that action. And then we're also needing to meet at least once a year in order to share this information with each other, decide what went well last year, and what we might want to modify for the coming year. So here's the 11 national projects spread around with their little pinpoints. And so you can see there are 5 in Nevada, there are 2 in Oregon, there's 1 in Idaho, 1 in Montana, 1 in Wyoming, and 1 in Colorado. I believe that the reason there are 5 in Nevada is because we have a large amount of permittees that are working off, circa 1980 or 90 allotment management plans that are very prescriptive. And so not all states are experiencing quite that level of prescriptiveness. I do also want to say that a big part of this, and fortunately the part I'm not in charge of, because as you can tell already, I'm no specialist in public affairs, but we have a lot of people in a lot of different positions. We have Intermountain West Joint Venture here in the back recording us today. They've also developed permittee biographies. So this is up on the top right or top left of that page. You can see the website the Partners in the Sage has started for the biographies of these different permittees that are involved. So it's pretty cool. You go to the website and, oh, that one popped out. Sorry. So you go to the website and you have the variety of different projects, and then you can click on it, and they've talked to all of the permittees involved and ask a variety of questions so you can become a little more knowledgeable about the permittees involved in the different projects. So I just pulled out a couple to show. And then we'll talk a little bit about a couple of the other projects. I didn't put anything in about the other 2 projects that we'll present because they'll be able to be very specific. But in the Ely district, here's an example. This is a cattle and sheep operator, and you can see they have a large amount of space that they cover. They're through several field offices. The linear feature that you see is their sheep trailing route. And so they go through ecological sites. The southern portion of their allotments are in the southern Mojave ecosystem, so they have a completely different species composition and seasonal requirements and abilities there than they have on the northern end that's in the Great Basin ecosystem. And one of their biggest goals, and I think this is the goal of the vast majority of permittees, is to have a sustainable operation that they can pass on to their children. And so some of the monitoring components. Now this project is still in the range health evaluation phase, so they have not yet started the NEPA, and they don't have an outcome-based grazing permit that they're working under. So this is still in the development phase, but they're already learning great lessons. And then we have Little Snake, Land and Livestock. This is the one closest to where we are right now. This one is in Craig, outside of Craig, Colorado. And they have a variety of allotments. These are 3 of the allotments that they have permits on. And so they've started to look at some long-term monitoring, and then recognizing that all your short-term monitoring and short-term objectives need to be directly tied into your long-term monitoring and objectives, because if those don't speak to each other, then you really won't get anywhere positive. And so one of the things that they're looking at, they are meeting rangeland health standards and they are meeting sage grouse habitat standards, and they're looking at enhancing some of those features, and they do they run their cows kind of like sheep, and so they move very frequently and leave the cows that have just calved and like move basically, every few weeks or a month at the most. And so they have a variety of small pastures, and they're looking at just the flexibility even of, going to that pasture as opposed to that pasture. And so it's been really eye-opening to me to recognize how flexibility means such a different thing to every operator on the ground. And so having less flexibility isn't necessarily less flexibility if that's all that particular operator needs to achieve their objectives. And then also some operational objectives. Now they're starting everything from the ecological perspective, but basically an operational objective is increased gains. And they recognize that they'll get increased gains through improved ecological conditions. Operational efficiency and cost saving. Everyone knows how much it costs to feed hay. How can those practices on the ground result in less hay fed through the year? And again, this is on 3 of the many allotments that they hold permits on, and so they're looking at this as also then a longer term, larger range plan for their other allotments. Wine Cup Gamble is here in the audience, but he's lucky enough not to be speaking right now. So this is one of the 1 million acre allotments, 1 million plus in Nevada. Well, I guess I'm not good at math, but almost 1 million. And so they have, mountains, valley bottoms. They have just a variety of topography, of ecological conditions, of ecological sites, of habitat needs. They have an incredible multitude of things to work with. And one of the things that they're doing to approach that is, for those of you that heard the targeted grazing talk that I gave before lunch, this will kind of sound familiar, but what they're looking at is approaching this from a disturbance response group ecological type foundation, instead of building objectives for a pasture, recognizing we have fire, we have other disturbances that change, the conditions that any particular location is at. They're looking at building objectives that are geared towards, when we are in this state of this ecological site, what types of things would we want to be managing towards? And that will allow for that flexibility then to even transcend the disturbance. So you may in a particular pasture be in a shrub state and be managing towards certain objectives. You have a fire come through, now you're in an annual grass state, and you don't have to reanalyze, you already have objectives for that ecological state. And they are also very front and center with recognizing the value that the permits and that the land stewardship has to the community as a whole, both socially and economically. And they're looking at ways to also have objectives and actual tangible monitoring plans associated with that. Deep Creek Ranch. So again, all of these 11 projects were in a different state of development when the initiative came forward, and are still in, each one is in its own state of development. Deep Creek was one that had been fully processed directly before the outcome-based initiative came out. They had a lot of embedded flexibility, so they entered their project into the initiative, but then they had to build some of the monitoring plans and other component parts afterwards to dovetail on the project that they had already built. So I'm not going to read all this because I think I already ran out of time. Good thing I'm the moderator. So basically what I wanted to highlight in this was that it took them years with, you can see in the middle paragraph, the variety of different entities and agencies that they worked with to develop projects, to to develop this, this flexible plan through years of coordinated effort. And in the long run, they got a 12-month season out of it, not meaning that they'll be in any one place for 12 months, but that they will then have, any part in the year to be able to have the grazing that is most appropriate for the conditions that year. They have a variety of range improvements, and they ended up with less of the projects moving forward than had originally been brought forward, but through those years of collaborative discussions, they settled on a lower level of projects. And they did have one reduction in AUMs. And so then they complemented with the monitoring plan, but I'm running short of time, so I'll cut myself off. So the lessons learned, there is an incredible balance between finding the right amount of detail and keeping it simple enough that we can actually do it and understand it. And so finding that right amount of detail and simplicity, that balance is beautiful when you find it. It's harder to get there than it sounds. Smart objectives. So they need to be specific. They need to, I forgot what smart meant. Measurable, thank you. Achievable, so you need to know what condition the land is in before you know what you can actually change through livestock management. They need to be relevant, so that's both time relevant and relevant to your needs on the land, and trackable. So we need monitoring plans that speak directly to them. Monitoring plans that are focused. We need to monitor the things to answer the questions that we have. None of us have all the time, money, and manpower to go out and monitor everything that we might want to, and that's why it's very important that we have objectives that are clearly defined so that we can make monitoring plans that are as efficient and focused as possible. Consistent manner of reporting flexibilities. So this is one of the things that I believe is one of the unique characteristics in outcome-based grazing that adaptive management fell short on before was that feedback loop. Okay, we've monitored. Now, how do we consistently bring that monitoring forward, share that monitoring, and process it to improve next year's management? And understanding of all monitoring techniques available. I'm sure many of you personally know how stuck certain people are on, the two monitoring techniques that they've used through their career or that they're familiar with or whatever. There's so many monitoring techniques out there, and we do not take full advantage of that. Collaboration is so vital. We will get nowhere without it, so thank you all for being here. And one of the big important things for having all this defined up front as well is we have already learned to expect turnover. We already knew it, but in the 2 years that we've been going through this national initiative, out of the 11 projects, we've had more than 6 of them with turnover at some level in BLM, and we've had a couple now with turnover on the rancher side as well. And so we don't need to rehash these conversations about what monitoring means every time there's turnover if we've already defined these things up front. Then a new manager comes in and you don't have to explain to them what it means on the ground. Everyone can already be calibrated and on the same page. So some of the next steps is a template for annual reporting. And develop further policy regarding the proper development and implementation of flexibility. This is something that we want to have available to all permittees in the long run. And continue working with a variety of contributors to develop accessible trainings for BLM staff, managers, and permittees. And we had a workshop in November. Well, I'll get to that one. We had a workshop in November where the projects, the BLM participants and the permittee participants came together with a variety of monitoring folks from the NOC and, just a big brainstorm of things. And we talked a lot about objectives, monitoring, flexibility, and reporting. And we realized that there is a lot of information that can be more effectively shared, and we have a variety of technological ways to do that now, and we're not fully taking advantage of those. We also anticipate that allotment management plan guidance will be revised through this effort, and we're looking forward to really developing a strong public communication plan, including a variety of media. Several of these projects already have little video clips and things like that. We're working on a variety of ways to keep people interested through the years of progress of this project. As you probably all know, there's regulation revision also occurring currently. We're in the scoping period for the grazing regulation revision. We're working off the 1995 regulations currently, and so we do want to ensure that as the regulations are revised, that they make it more logical to implement flexibility as opposed to anything other than that. And also examine how RAS can better capture outcome-based, but that's the administration system that we have. Pretty boring to you guys. And I'm open to suggestions and needs that you may also see as next steps. And here is a picture of 9 of the 11 projects. Yes, sir?
How many cows?
Oh, sorry, I forgot that one part.
How many cows does that 1 million acre operation have?
Well, heartbeats. So, yeah, exactly. So it fluctuates. They've never actually run at full numbers yet. So that's one thing that they're working on. James Rogers, right there in the audience, is the permittee participant to said project, but it is many. He has many ranch operators. He can answer that if he wants to. Okay. So that was one thing I forgot. We are being recorded. Against my better judgment, I said yes. And so if you guys do have questions, wait for the microphone to come to you so they can record the question as well. Oh, that was easy.
I have a question.
Oh, dang.
So how do you see this, where we're at in the outcome-based grazing demonstration projects, actually informing what's going on with the current, revamping of grazing policy? I mean, it seems like it happened a lot faster than what some of us were hoping for, because we were hoping to have more information
right.
And have learned some things. And so, I realize I'm not trying to throw it, how do you see it now? Because maybe what we've learned so far can at least be used. We were hoping we would have learned a lot more before you're redoing policy, but how are you seeing it as the lead of this from your viewpoint to help inform
right.
current amendments or changes to the grazing policy?
Well, and to be honest, I think that although not all of the projects have gone through NEPA and have actual permits yet, I think every project has gone through enough to bring forward some very tangible lessons learned. And I think that the regulations, I think that the part that we're going through now in terms of the development of these things is the more important lessons learned that may need modification in the regulations, as opposed to much of the administration then will still be the same, And so some of the component parts for how you deal with how you deal with the rest of the stuff. I mean, there's, all the sections about how you do decisions and how you do this. Like, those are not, I believe, the most relevant parts that would need modification to make outcome-based grazing more feasible. So it is, many of you have probably heard me say that all of these things that are happening are amazing. It'd be great if there was some sequence to them, but here we are with all of them happening, so. Okay, last question, then I'll turn it over.
I was was wondering on the monitoring methods that you talked about, and the difficulty of everybody has their like 2 monitoring methods that they've used, and then they just want to repeat whatever. But I was curious if you, or how you handle, for example, if there's been a lot of monitoring in that area using different methods like Daubenmeier, and then there's interest in switching to another cover monitoring method. How do you balance maybe historic data with changing monitoring methods? So I don't know, how do you deal with that transition or challenge?
Right. That's a good question, and it's something that came up even before outcome-based grazing with just the AIM protocol, and then people were abandoning frequency plots, and it's just so if you have historic data and that plot is still in a location that there isn't a fence that was built through it since its inception, or if it's still in a relevant location, I am not going to ever advocate abandoning a historic plot, because you can't replace that data. You may be able to complement it with a very simplistic method that could give you more at that location. But I think that what we've found is that not all historic data has been put in with the methods that we need to answer the questions that we have. And so if you have it and it's answering your questions, there's no need to change it just because there's like a new shiny thing out there. But if it's not answering your questions, don't be married to it just because.